You feel pain like no other pain, and you know that in your life it's going to be very difficult too. The ceremony had been rehearsed to the second. The guests had taken their places, and Windsor Castle appeared prepared for another flawless display of royal unity. Then Camilla rose from her chair and delivered an outburst so personal that William's expression collapsed in front of the room. Charles did not hesitate. He stepped forward, ordered the ceremony halted, and left the assembled household staring at a future king who could no longer hide his tears. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William had entered St. George's Hall, expecting a moment of controlled dignity. The ceremonial charter waiting beside Charles was a formal document setting out the duties of the senior royals who represented the crown, and its first signed copy was meant to pass directly from sovereign to heir. That exchange mattered because it would show the household that father and son still stood together after months of strained meetings, delayed briefings, and whispered arguments over the monarchy's future. Camilla watched from beside the king as Catherine and Anne sat in the front row. William thanked his father, unfolded his speech, and began speaking about service, continuity, and family unity. Then the queen consort stood. She accused the prince of treating Charles like a throne to inherit rather than a father to protect, and the words struck the hall with the force of a public verdict. She said his private planning had humiliated the monarch within his own household. William tried to answer without raising his voice. He failed only when Camilla invoked Diana, claiming he had inherited his mother's gift for turning private pain into public pressure. The future king lowered the pages in his hands. He looked toward Catherine, fought for another sentence, and broke down before he could finish it. Charles watched his son struggle for several unbearable seconds. Then the king raised one hand and ended the ceremony. He crossed the floor, took the speech from William's shaking fingers, and said quietly, "You do not have to stand here and endure this." Camilla remained frozen as the monarch led his son away. The doors closed before the guests could leave. Staff phones were collected, and the official broadcast feed vanished without explanation. A senior equerry then found handwritten notes beneath Camilla's abandoned program. The recorded account he later gave to Anne confirmed that several lines matched her outburst word for word. Anne lifted the pages herself. One sentence had been underlined twice. "He has already begun ruling around you." The ceremony was over, but the deeper wound had only just begun to open to the public. Charles, Camilla, and William represented a stable royal structure. The king, the queen, and the heir, who would one day carry the crown forward. Inside Windsor, however, their relationship had become painfully fragile. Charles wanted loyalty without confrontation. William wanted honesty without humiliation. Camilla believed the prince's growing authority was isolating her husband, and Catherine understood that one careless sentence could turn a constitutional transition into a permanent family fracture. William sat beside the narrow window of the Garter Tower room, still holding the ceremonial charter across his lap. The charter was the formal document meant to define the duties of senior working royals, and it mattered because the king had intended to hand it to his son as proof that their partnership remained strong. Now the pages felt like evidence of everything that had gone wrong. The prince stared at the words without reading them and asked Catherine why Charles had allowed Camilla's resentment to grow unchecked. Catherine moved closer and lowered herself beside his chair. She took the document from his hands, placed it face down on the table, and told him that tears had not weakened him. Silence would have done that. She reminded William that his mother's memory had been used against him in a room where he could not defend himself without appearing cruel, disloyal, or ungrateful. The future king listened, but the wound remained deeper than humiliation. He feared his father had watched the tension rise and chosen comfort over truth. Charles felt that accusation even before William spoke it aloud. In the adjoining chamber, the king removed his glasses and pressed both hands against the desk as an aide began discussing damage control. He dismissed the room at once. Only Anne remained. The monarch admitted that he had recognized Camilla's anger for weeks, yet he had convinced himself it would fade if he refused to feed it. Anne placed the handwritten notes before him. She asked whether any of the language looked familiar. Charles did not answer. His silence revealed enough. 2 nights earlier, Camilla had used similar words during a private argument, accusing William of building a future court while his father was still reigning. The king had treated it as fear spoken in anger. He had never believed she would carry that fear into St. George's Hall. Camilla's fear had not appeared from nowhere. Briefings about royal residences, patronages, and the future working family had begun reaching William before they reached her office. Some advisors believed the prince needed greater control because he already carried a growing share of public duty. Others feared that every new responsibility made Charles's reign appear temporary. The household had quietly divided around them. Catherine then broke the final silence. In a private account later recorded for Anne, she explained that the outburst had begun weeks earlier at Sandringham, when Camilla overheard one sentence through a partly open door. That sentence would turn anxiety into open hostility. 3 weeks before Windsor fell silent, a conversation behind the locked doors of Sandringham House altered the balance of the royal family. It was meant to be a practical discussion between Charles and William about the king's schedule. Camilla was not invited, yet from the adjoining corridor, she heard one sentence that convinced her the future court was already being constructed without her. From that moment, every delayed briefing and closed meeting began to look like evidence of betrayal. Charles met William without aides in the ground floor study, while Catherine waited elsewhere, and Camilla believed they were discussing estate maintenance. The autumn program had become punishing, and the prince feared his father was being pushed beyond reason. He proposed a temporary continuity group, a small team allowed to handle routine decisions whenever the monarch needed rest. William presented it as protection, not replacement. Still, the plan mattered, because it touched the one subject nobody inside the family could discuss without fear: the transfer of power. Camilla heard raised voices and moved toward the partly open door. Then Charles said the sentence that changed everything. When William becomes king, he must not inherit the confusion I inherited. The king meant scattered paperwork, competing offices, and an administrative system that exhausted everyone around him. She heard something else. To the queen consort, confusion sounded like a verdict on the household she had helped build and the place she expected to retain beside her husband. Camilla confronted Charles over dinner that evening. She placed her napkin beside an untouched plate and asked whether she was part of the confusion. He denied it, but he did not explain the full proposal. Instead, the monarch said succession planning could not be avoided. She heard surrender in his voice. She accused him of letting William rehearse sovereignty while his father was still alive and reigning. The tension deepened the next morning. William's draft vanished from a red dispatch folder, the secure case used to carry confidential royal papers. It returned hours later with several lines marked in pencil, including one stating that the Queen's office would hold no independent authority under the temporary arrangement. Anne later compared those markings with the notes recovered at Windsor. Her documented account confirmed the same narrow writing and the same double underlining. William still tried to repair the damage. Before the ceremony, he met Camilla alone in the green drawing room and assured her that he had never intended to isolate her. She closed the folder he had brought, pushed it back across the table, and said, "Intentions become meaningless when the doors are already closing." The prince believed the exchange had ended in cold restraint. It had not. Camilla had already begun writing the words she would deliver before the entire household. The misunderstanding had become a prepared accusation, and Charles was about to face the anger he had spent weeks refusing to name. Minutes after stopping the ceremony, Charles entered the Queen's private sitting room and closed the door behind him. No secretary accompanied him. No courtier remained to soften his words. Camilla stood beside the fireplace, still holding the program from the abandoned ceremony. The king placed her handwritten notes on the table between them and asked one devastating question. Had she intended to break William in public, or had hurting him simply become acceptable collateral in protecting her place? Charles had already made certain William was with Catherine before entering the room. Anne remained outside, blocking every aide who tried to approach. The monarch needed the truth without interruption. Camilla answered that the prince's growing authority was turning her husband into a ceremonial figure before his reign had even ended. She believed William's advisors were building a future court where the king's wishes would be treated as delays rather than commands. Charles refused to accept that defense. He told her that protecting his dignity did not give her the right to attack his son or drag Diana's memory into a public confrontation. The name changed the room. Camilla looked away, and for the first time since the ceremony, her certainty weakened. Camilla struck back with years of resentment. She accused Charles of becoming emotionally absent. Whenever William challenged her, she reminded him that he had once asked her to endure public hatred, cruel headlines, and suspicion without retreating. Yet when his own household began planning beyond her, she said he offered patience instead of protection. The queen consort had not only feared losing influence, she had feared being abandoned inside the very institution she had spent years defending. Charles lifted the Windsor program and tore the page containing William's speech in half. He placed both pieces beside her notes. The ceremony could be repaired, he said. Another date could be chosen, another speech written, another charter signed. But the image of his son crying beneath the castle banners could never be taken back. Camilla finally revealed how deeply the fear had been fed. In a recorded private conversation later preserved for the Household Review, she admitted that someone from William's planning circle had warned her about sharp restrictions after Charles's reign. She had been told her access to royal residences, security arrangements, and official correspondence would be reduced almost immediately. Charles demanded a name. Camilla hesitated before identifying Sir Malcolm Reeves, the senior coordinator who moved information between the royal offices. Reeves had described a possible contingency plan as a settled decision and convinced her that William had already approved her removal. Camilla's anger collapsed. She admitted that without Charles's protection, she did not know who she would become. The outburst had never been only about authority. It had come from the terror of becoming unwanted again. Charles offered no reassurance. He left the room and walked toward the household office where Reeves and the documents behind his warning were waiting. Someone inside the palace had turned succession planning into a weapon. Royal crises are rarely created by one dramatic sentence alone. They are built through missing context, carefully timed warnings, and private fears placed in the hands of people already prepared to believe them. In a narrow Windsor office, Charles faced the official who had told Camilla that William intended to erase her future. The king expected political calculation. What he discovered instead was a campaign driven by an old courtier's fear that William would dismantle the world he controlled. Sir Malcolm Reeves stood inside the private secretary's office with his hands clasped behind his back. He had served the household for more than 2 decades, moving papers between Charles, Camilla, and William while deciding which concerns reached the monarch first. That quiet control mattered because a delayed briefing could create suspicion, and a distorted summary could turn routine planning into a personal threat. Charles placed the disputed document on the desk. It did not remove Camilla from any residence, cancel her security, or block her access to royal records. The paper only listed possible arrangements for the widowed consort of a sovereign. meaning the surviving husband or wife of a monarch after that reign ended. No proposal had been approved, no order carried William's signature. Charles asked whether Reeves had described that unfinished discussion as the prince's settled decision. The official hesitated. That pause became his confession. Reeves claimed William's advisors were moving too quickly. He said experienced courtiers were being dismissed as pieces of an outdated court, while the future king gathered more authority around himself. Frightening Camilla, he admitted in a recorded account prepared for the household inquiry, had been intended to force Charles to slow the reforms. He expected her to object privately. He never expected her to attack the prince before the entire Windsor household. Charles felt anger, but guilt followed it. Reeves had succeeded because the king had allowed suspicion to grow between three separate offices. The monarch set down his pen and said that when a ruler permits silence around him, other people eventually begin speaking in his name. Anne entered carrying 3 briefing folders. Each contained an altered cover note. Neutral proposals from William's team had been rewritten as attempts to weaken Charles or strip Camilla of influence. The pattern was no mistake. Reeves had been feeding fear in small controlled doses and then produced the final proof. Reeves had personally ensured Camilla received the continuity paper on the morning of the ceremony, knowing William's speech would celebrate a closer partnership with his father. The timing had been chosen to provoke her. Charles ended the conversation. He removed Reeves from duty, ordered him to surrender his access card, and placed Anne in charge of an independent review of every briefing exchanged between the royal offices. The architect of the crisis had been exposed, but the damage had already escaped his control. William was upstairs, folding away his ceremonial coat and preparing to leave Windsor without speaking to his father. While Charles questioned the official who had manipulated the household, William returned to his apartments and removed the ceremonial insignia pinned to his coat. He placed it beside the unsigned charter and asked that the car be brought to the private entrance. The prince was not resigning from duty, nor was he challenging his father. He was doing something more painful, leaving Windsor before anger forced him to say words that could never be withdrawn. William heard the formal announcement before he reached the inner corridor. Guests had been told the presentation was postponed because of an unexpected family matter. The charter remained unsigned. The reception was abandoned and prepared statements disappeared from the palace website. The document mattered because it was meant to confirm the partnership between sovereign and heir. Instead, it now stood as proof that the family could not complete even one public gesture of unity. Staff members lowered their eyes as William passed. Nobody mentioned illness, scheduling, or protocol because everyone understood the truth. They had watched Camilla strike at him, seen Charles stop the ceremony, and witnessed the future king lose control before the room. Their silence felt heavier than open gossip. William changed out of his ceremonial coat and folded it carefully. He asked an aide to return it to the wardrobe, then noticed the damp mark on his speech where his tears had fallen. His hands, steady until that moment, tightened around the pages. Catherine supported his decision to leave for Adelaide Cottage, but she warned him against turning Charles's past silence into proof that the king approved of Camilla's attack. She reminded him that his father had crossed the hall, taken the speech from his hands, and ended the humiliation before it could continue. William shook his head. Charles had acted only when the damage became visible, he said. The deeper betrayal was that the monarch already knew Camilla feared his growing role and still chose not to confront it. His father had protected peace until peace became cruelty. Charles arrived moments after the car had gone. He found the unsigned charter on the table and stood beside it without speaking. Removing Reeves had exposed the machinery behind the crisis, but it had not repaired the wound between father and son. Camilla refused the public apology drafted by advisors. She rejected its description of the outburst as an emotional misunderstanding because it ignored the fear beneath her anger. Charles answered with a decision of his own. Until the review ended, she would not accompany him to two coming engagements. The order remained private, but nobody inside Windsor misunderstood it. Night had fallen when Charles dismissed his security detail at the cottage drive. He carried no speech, no folder, and no symbol of office. The king approached William's door alone, finally ready to speak as a father. The most important conversation of the Windsor crisis did not take place beneath banners, before advisors, or inside a royal office. It happened late at night in a small sitting room with Charles and William facing each other across an untouched tray of tea. There were no aides to blame, no documents to interpret, and no ceremony to protect. The king had come to ask forgiveness. The prince had to decide whether his father's late honesty could reach a wound years of silence had deepened. Charles arrived alone and asked Catherine for permission to speak privately with her husband. She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. The princess told the king that William did not need another explanation of palace procedure, meaning the formal rules used to manage royal decisions and public conduct. He needed his father. Charles accepted the rebuke and entered without defending himself. William did not rise. He acknowledged Charles quietly, then left the chair opposite him empty until the monarch chose to sit without invitation. That small refusal mattered because the prince was no longer willing to make the conversation easier for the man who had avoided it for so long. Charles admitted the truth first. He had seen Camilla's fear and mistaken patience for wisdom. He believed silence would calm her, but silence had allowed fear to become resentment, and resentment to become cruelty. The king said he had protected temporary peace while leaving his son exposed to a deeper wound. William answered with controlled pain. Camilla's attack had not broken him because she questioned his judgment. It had broken him because Diana had been used as an accusation while his father stood only a few feet away. The future king needed one honest answer. Did Charles believe he was exploiting the crown he would someday inherit? Charles reached into his coat and removed the unsigned charter. The document was meant to define how royal responsibility would pass between sovereign and heir. But now it carried another purpose. The monarch tore away the prepared dedication, took out a pen, and wrote, "Authority without trust is only another form of loneliness." Charles then rejected every distorted claim Reeves had planted. Succession planning was not betrayal. Preparing William to reign was part of the king's duty, and the prince had never tried to rule around him. William did not offer immediate forgiveness. He agreed to return to Windsor only if the next ceremony refused to pretend the family was untouched. Charles would first admit what had happened inside the household. Charles rose to leave. William finally stood. The king placed one hand on his son's shoulder, and the prince allowed it to remain there. "Do not wait until I break next time," William said. Father and son had chosen honesty over distance. Now Charles had to return to Windsor and tell Camilla what accountability would demand. By morning, the palace could no longer contain the story. A single image taken before the broadcast feed was cut showed Charles reaching toward William while the prince looked down at the speech in his hands. It carried no sound, yet it told the public everything. Something had shattered inside Windsor. Within hours, crowds gathered outside the castle. Broadcasters abandoned their scheduled coverage, and one newspaper printed a front page that transformed a private wound into a national judgment. Charles had authorized only a brief announcement, saying the ceremony was postponed because of a family matter. That explanation collapsed as witness accounts spread. People learned that Camilla had interrupted William, that the king had stopped the event, and that the heir had left the hall in tears. The broadcast feed, meaning the official live video sent to television networks, had been cut too late to hide the moment that mattered most. Broadcasters moved away from arguments about succession and focused on the pain inside the image. One commentator described William's tears as the end of royal emotional silence. The debate quickly became larger than one family. Viewers began asking whether royal dignity should require a person to hide grief while standing before a room filled with witnesses. The Daily Chronicle gave the crisis its most brutal headline: "A father too late, a son in tears." Charles's hand reached toward William while Camilla appeared blurred behind them. The words accused the king of acting only after his son had already broken. Crowds gathered along the long walk by midday. One woman placed flowers beneath the castle railings, with a handwritten card reading, "Strength does not mean standing alone." The message spread across broadcasts because it captured what many believed the prince had been denied inside Windsor. William watched the coverage from Adelaide Cottage. When the broadcaster called his tears a national symbol, he switched off the television. The future king had wanted privacy, not admiration. His most vulnerable moment now belonged to millions of strangers. Camilla faced the same image alone. She unfolded the newspaper in her sitting room and stared at her own blurred figure behind Charles and William. For the first time, the queen consort saw the outburst from beyond her fear. She no longer appeared threatened. She appeared responsible. Charles rejected the statement prepared by advisors. It blamed incomplete briefings, but avoided personal accountability. The king said that institutional language, carefully controlled wording, designed to protect the palace, would repeat the silence that caused the crisis. Camilla then asked for a private meeting with William. In a recorded conversation with Charles, she abandoned her demand that her fears be explained beside the apology. Fear could explain her actions. She admitted it could not excuse them. The public had delivered its judgment. The final verdict would come inside Windsor, where all three would stand together again. 7 days after the outburst, the doors of St. George's Hall opened again. The same charter waited on the same table, but the illusion surrounding it had disappeared. Charles entered first. William followed with Catherine. Camilla arrived last, carrying no prepared notes and taking a seat away from the central position she had occupied before. The ceremony would continue, but not as though nothing had happened. This time, the monarchy would survive not by concealing its fracture, but by admitting exactly how it had been caused. Charles restricted attendance to the family and the senior staff who had witnessed the original confrontation. He refused to turn the return into another display of perfect royal unity. The ceremonial charter, a formal document setting out how duties would be shared between the sovereign and heir, now carried more weight than before. It no longer represented appearance. It represented whether trust could survive after humiliation. Camilla approached William before the ceremony began. Charles was not beside her, and no advisor had written the words. She apologized for attacking his character, using Diana's memory against him, and choosing a public setting where any response would have deepened his pain. The queen consort did not ask him to understand her fear before accepting her regret. William listened without interrupting. He accepted the apology, but he did not erase the boundary. Reconciliation, the prince said, required more than sorrow after the damage was done. His mother's memory and his relationship with Charles could never again become weapons in an argument about influence. Camilla lowered her eyes, folded the Windsor program, and placed it aside. She said trust would have to return through conduct, not promises. For once, she offered no defense. Charles then addressed the room. The king admitted that his refusal to confront private fear had allowed other people to turn it into division. Sir Malcolm Reeves's removal had become permanent after the review proved he had altered briefings between the royal offices. A joint secretariat, a shared team ensuring all three households received the same documents, would prevent anyone from controlling information through delay or distortion. Charles signed the charter and handed it to William without the original speech. The future king accepted it, paused, and looked directly at his father. The monarch answered with a small nod. not as a sovereign granting power, but as a parent recognizing the son he had almost failed to protect. Camilla remained beside Charles, but her informal control over succession briefings ended. William's continuity group was approved under the king's direct oversight. What had been presented as a threat became an open partnership. The Windsor crisis did not end with every scar erased. It ended with clearer boundaries. A manipulator removed, an apology accepted without forgetting the harm, and a father choosing honesty before silence could wound his son again. The first ceremony ended with William's tears and Charles's raised hand. The second ended with accountability, restored trust, and a monarchy that finally understood silence was not dignity. It was the danger that had nearly divided them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.